You think Canada is run by its government. It isn't. 5 corporations make decisions every single day that affect what you eat, where you bank, what you watch, and how much everything costs. Most Canadians have no idea these companies even exist in the same sentence, and the ones who do, they're not talking. Welcome to Untold Wealth Theory, where the money trails most people never follow lead to the stories that actually explain the world. Let's start with a number, 90%. That's the share of English language grocery retail in Canada controlled by just 3 companies. Not 10, not 7. 3. And the moment you stop to think about that, really think about it, something starts to feel a little off. Because competition is supposed to keep prices down. It's supposed to give you choices. But what happens when the competition quietly disappears and the companies left standing just happen to be very, very old friends? The answer isn't in the news. It's in the ownership records. And that's exactly where we're going. The first corporation on this list is Loblaw Companies Limited. On the surface, it's a grocery chain, a Canadian staple. Walk into any Loblaws, Zayres, No Frills, Real Canadian Superstore or Shoppers Drug Mart and you're in their ecosystem. Most people know the name. What they don't know is just how wide that ecosystem actually stretches. Loblaw is controlled by the Weston family, one of the wealthiest dynasties in Canadian history. Galen Weston Sr. built the empire. His son, now bearing the same name, has sat at the top of Canada's grocery world during the most painful inflation crisis in a generation. While Canadians were cutting back on meat and skipping brand names, Loblaw reported record profits. In 2022 alone, the company posted over $529 million in net earnings, a 40% jump from the year before. Politicians called it price gouging. Loblaw called it supply chain costs. The truth probably lives somewhere uncomfortable in between. But here's what makes Loblaw more than just a grocery story. Through its parent company, George Weston Limited, and its investment arm, the Westons have fingers in commercial real estate across the country through Choice Properties, REIT. They own the land under the stores. They collect rent from competing retailers. They bake bread in facilities that supply not just their own shelves, but their rivals' shelves too. It's not a grocery company. It's a quietly assembled virtuary of Canada's food system, and they've been building it for over 100 years. Now here's where it gets strange, because the second corporation on this list is not a competitor to Loblaw. It's a financial institution that acts like an empire in its own right, and Canadians interact with it almost every day without realising what it actually controls. Royal Bank of Canada, RBC, is not just the largest bank in Canada. It's one of the 15 largest banks in the entire world by market capitalisation. It manages over $2 trillion in assets. To put that in perspective, Canada's entire GDP is roughly $2 trillion. RBC is, in financial terms, approximately the size of Canada. But the dominance of RBC isn't just about size, it's about concentration. Canada has what economists call an oligopolistic banking system dominated by just 5 major banks, sometimes called the Big Five. And within that group, RBC consistently sits at the top. It controls a massive share of personal banking, mortgages, investment management and corporate lending. When a Canadian business needs capital to grow or to survive, it almost always goes through one of these 5 institutions. And RBC is the first call. What that means in practice is that RBC doesn't just hold your savings account. It decides which industries get funded, which real estate developments get loans, which startups get institutional investment. It's an invisible hand, not in the Adam Smith sense, but in the very literal sense that most Canadians never see it shaping the decisions that shape their lives. If you're getting value from this breakdown, and we're just getting started, hit subscribe. Untold Wealth Theory covers the economic stories that sit just beneath the surface of what you're told. This is exactly that kind of story. The third corporation operates differently than the first 2. It doesn't sell you groceries, it doesn't hold your mortgage, but it reaches into your home through every screen, every speaker, and every cell signal you've ever used. Rogers Communications is not just a telecom company. It is the single most powerful gatekeeper of Canadian media and communications in the country's history. Rogers controls wireless networks, cable infrastructure, internet service, and since its $26 billion acquisition of Shaw Communications in 2023, one of the largest corporate mergers in Canadian history, it now has a stranglehold on Western Canada that was almost unthinkable a decade ago. The deal faced enormous regulatory scrutiny. Critics said it would reduce competition and raise prices. It went through anyway, with some conditions attached. And now Rogers operates a network of channels, streaming services, sports properties and cell towers that no single company has ever held simultaneously in this country. Here's the pattern break. Rogers also owns the Toronto Blue Jays. It owns Sportsnet, which broadcasts NHL, MLB and NBA games. It owns the arena the Raptors and Maple Leafs play in. If you want to watch Canadian sports and Garadik as a Canadian, you are almost certainly paying Rogers to do it. They don't just own the game, they own the screen, the signal, and sometimes the seat. That's not business dominance, that's architecture. They've built the walls of the room and they get to charge admission to enter it. The fourth corporation on this list is one that most people outside Canada have never heard of. And that obscurity is part of what makes it so powerful. Power Corporation of Canada sounds like it was named by someone who had already given up on subtlety. And in a way that makes sense, because power is exactly what it deals in. Power Corporation is a holding company, which means it doesn't make products or offer services that ordinary people interact with directly. Instead, it owns enormous stakes in companies that do. It controls Great West Lifeco, one of the largest insurance and financial services companies in North America. It owns IGM Financial, which manages the investment portfolios of millions of Canadians. Its web of ownership extends into media, infrastructure, fintech, and European financial markets. The Desmarais family has controlled Power Corporation for decades. Paul Desmarais Sr. was, for a generation, arguably the most politically connected businessman in Canadian history. He had relationships with prime ministers across party lines, Trudeau, Chrétien, Mulroney, in ways that blurred the line between private wealth and public policy. When he died in 2013, the tributes that poured in from political leaders around the world told you everything about how power actually moves in this country. It doesn't always move through Parliament. Sometimes it moves through a phone call from a man whose company manages your pension. Power Corporation doesn't make headlines. It doesn't need to. It makes policy, slowly, quietly, through the kind of relationships that are never quite on the record. The fifth corporation is arguably the most globally significant of all of them, and yet most Canadians think of it as just a place to shop for lumber. Brookfield Asset Management is a Toronto headquartered investment giant that manages over $900 billion in assets worldwide. Not in Canada, worldwide. Brookfield owns infrastructure on 6 continents, toll roads in Australia, pipelines in the Americas, utilities in Europe, cell towers in India, data centres across the United States. It is one of the most powerful alternative asset managers in the world, sitting alongside names like Blackstone and KKR in terms of its reach and influence over real-world physical infrastructure. Here's why that matters for the average person. Infrastructure is not abstract. Infrastructure is the road you drive on, the power that comes through your wall, the broadband that carries your video call. When a company like Brookfield owns infrastructure in dozens of countries, it is collecting rent, in the economic sense, from billions of people who have no idea they're paying it. They just know the bill arrived. Brookfield has increasingly positioned itself in the green energy transition, buying renewable assets globally and branding itself as a force for climate-conscious investment. Whether that's genuine strategy or clever marketing is a question that depends heavily on your perspective. But what isn't debatable is that Brookfield has turned the invisible scaffolding of modern civilization into one of the most profitable investment theses of the 21st century. Now step back for a moment, because the most important thing about these 5 corporations is not what any one of them does individually, it's what they represent together. Loblaw controls food, RBC controls capital, Rogers controls information and communications, Power Corporation controls financial planning and political proximity. Brookfield controls the physical infrastructure of modern life. These aren't 5 separate stories. They're one story, told 5 different ways, about how economic power in Canada has quietly consolidated into fewer and fewer hands over the last 50 years. This is not a conspiracy. No one had a secret meeting and divided Canada into 5 pieces. What actually happened is slower and in some ways more troubling. It happened through regulatory capture, the gradual process by which industries write the rules that govern them. It happened through acquisition, one company buying another, then another, until the map of competition looks like a corporate family tree instead of a marketplace. And it happened through proximity to power, the kind of relationships that turn lobbying into policy and policy into profit. Canada prides itself on being different from the United States, more equitable, less extreme, more regulated. But when you follow the ownership chains, really follow them, you find a country where a surprisingly small number of families and institutions sit at the intersection of food, money, media, policy, and infrastructure. That's not uniquely Canadian. That's just what happens when enough time passes and enough deals get done quietly enough. Here's the question that should stay with you after this video. If 5 corporations can quietly shape the daily economic reality of 38 million people, what does that mean for competition, for democracy, and for the next generation of Canadians trying to build something in a country where the table is already set? That's not a rhetorical question. It's a real one. And the fact that it doesn't get asked in mainstream conversation as often as it should, well, that might be the most revealing detail of all. Drop a comment below. Which of these 5 surprised you most? Or if you're Canadian, have you felt this kind of corporate concentration in your own life, in your bills, your choices, your options? I want to read what you actually think. And if this video made something click for you, share it with someone who talks about Canadian politics or the economy. Not because it pushes a single agenda, but because the most dangerous economic forces are the ones people don't have names for yet. Now you have 5.